Welcome to The Facts and the Furious, the podcast covering science, or lack thereof, in the Fast and Furious franchise. I'm one of your co-hosts, Melissa Miller. I'm a science writer and also co-host of the podcast Star Wars Ologies.
And I'm your other co-host, Dr. Lisa Will, a professor of physics and astronomy and all-around nerd. In this episode, The Facts and the Furious is going to cover the eighth movie, 2017's Fate of the Furious. We'll also chat with a computer scientist about hacking and the god's eye of it all in the saga, so stick around for that.
All right, well, first up, let's dive into the physics questions.
Oh, you're gonna want to work for me. You're gonna betray your brothers, abandon your code, and shatter your family. You see, your team is about to go up against the only thing they can't handle.
What's that?
You.
All right, so I'm just going to say, strangely, there's not as much physics to talk about in this movie, which, especially coming off Furious 7, which had so much to talk about, was kind of surprising when we went back and looked at it. And I think it's because they really went, technological thriller.
Yeah, because it really did feel right after watching 7 that this one, I didn't have nearly as many questions for you. There's still plenty of nonsense. There's still lots of shenanigans. We travel to like however many different locations, introduce new bad guys and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, in terms of the physics, remarkably grounded, I guess.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the Fast and Furious franchise, you can make the physics work, but in the extreme, right? Everything just has to work just perfectly. And I think
Right.
this movie falls into that as well. The thing I remember from this movie is the introduction of the mom character. I think I was just so distracted by Helen Mirren that it was hard to
Yeah.
focus on anything else.
No, that's totally fair. Helen Mirren is delightful. It amazes me how much chemistry she has with Vin
Yes.
Diesel because, 8 movies in and, Letty and Dom, obviously great couple or whatever, but there's not always a really strong connection there. And so honestly, sometimes I ship Dom and Mrs. Shaw a little bit more. In 8, in 9, and in 10, every scene is just like it's amazing.
I think that distracted me from some of the perhaps poor choices in physics.
Or hairstyles.
You don't like Cipher's hairstyle?
In any of the movies, they're terrible. I guess by 10, it's just normal hair. But in this one and in 9, it's just like, but why? Like, it's Charlize Theron. Like, we don't need to, like, add some sort of gimmick. I will say that, especially in the rewatch of this movie I did for this episode, I think Vin Diesel does his best acting I've ever seen in this movie. And it's mostly in the scenes with Charlize Theron. So I don't know, again, if there was
Yes.
just sort of chemistry there where she brought out the best in him or whatever. But like, there are tears at some point. Like, if you go back and think about it with this movie, I think it stands out how good of an actor Vin Diesel is. And their scenes, especially together, really, really sparkle.
They gave him other stuff to do than just being an action hero in this
Right.
movie. And so it gave him a chance to do more stuff. And I really do think that sometimes you put two actors together and they elevate scenes that you might not have gotten with another pairing. And so I
Right.
think Charlize Theron and Helen Mirren both kind of did that. By the time you get into this point in the franchise, how popular the franchise is, that with some of the actors that they've been able to bring
Yeah.
in the past couple of movies, people want to be in these
Oscar
movies.
winners. No, that's absolutely true. Because, yeah, my guess is that both of those actors reached out to Fast and Furious to be like, got something for me to do? Or if they didn't and their agents got the call, that clearly they were game. These are both,
Absolutely.
serious actors who probably get offered all sorts of roles. And for them to be like, yeah, I will come be your random hacking bad guy expert, or I will come and be Jason Statham's mom, who's like,
Yes.
also, got this interesting accent and is, a criminal. Like, absolutely. So good for
Yeah,
them.
I agree.
Well, to get us into the plot a little bit, there's the sort of James Bond opening car chase thing in Cuba, which we talked about some with our car expert back in episode 1. Honestly, Hobbs's introduction in this one with like his daughter's soccer team doing the haka and terrifying those little
So
girls.
funny.
So
So funny.
funny. The soccer moms in the stands, there being like more of them than there are children. Hilarious. Like, I love that. So Mr. Nobody showing up and gives him this, off the books mission. If you're caught, we will disavow all knowledge. Like, okay, sure. And then we don't know anything more we don't get any introduction to the heist, the players. We don't get that whole bringing the team back together thing. No, it's just like, and then immediately we are in Berlin. There's explosions. There's a wrecking ball. And then, Dom turns on everybody, apparently.
So some of the stuff that goes on during the sequence where you have an electromagnetic pulse, that's one of the things that happens because we're talking about computer technology and hacking and needing to get the God's eye still, because that's a carryover from the previous movie, including maybe some retconning and
Maybe just a scotch.
maybe just a little bit. And so one of the things that gets brought up is that somebody shows up with a report about an EMP. And that is the beginning of this off the books mission, if I recall correctly. An EMP is an electromagnetic pulse, basically a burst of energy that creates an electromagnetic field of some sort, an electric field, a magnetic field that can actually fry your electronics, is what you're worried about. So rapidly changing electric fields and magnetic fields can drive currents. And so what you're worried about is a current going through your machinery that it's not expecting at a level that it's not expecting. These can happen naturally. We see these being talked about in terms of nuclear weapons most often, or in this case, some sort of small device that can trigger one. But lightning can cause an electromagnetic pulse. And, as an astrophysicist by training, I keep thinking of the fact that you can get these large solar explosions that can trigger problems in our satellites. And so they tend to go into a safe mode and go down to the minimal amount of electronics operating so they don't get current surges going through their equipment. Electromagnetic pulses can actually cause damage to satellite communications and even electrical grids. And so people tend to worry about them in terms of weaponization as being something that you can use on purpose to actually like take down an entire country's communications or power grid. So the idea of an EMP is actually realistic. Whether or not it is realistic in the way that it plays out in the movie. So once again, it's whether or not it plays out correctly. Some objects and cars get affected more than others by this EMP in the movie.
Right.
And that could honestly be true. Electronics that are functioning are more likely to be affected than a device that's turned off. And magnetic storage would be more likely to be affected as well. Yeah, so an electromagnetic pulse causing problems is absolutely physically possible.
Nice. Okay. And what about wrecking balls? I mean, everything I know about wrecking balls, I learned from the Miley Cyrus music video, probably. But it's such a thing that, like, when it's introduced here, it's just like, I think Tej, like, lets it go and, like, nobody else knew it was going to happen. So it just seems like poor, planning or whatever. And thankfully, it only takes out bad guys.
I loved it. Wrecking balls are not commonly used anymore because there are more, how shall we say, directional ways to take down buildings at this point. But a wrecking ball is basically just a giant pendulum that has a really, 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 really heavy or massive pendulum bob at the end. And so the idea is that, yeah, you release it from a height. That gravitational potential energy it has at a certain height translates into kinetic energy of a certain speed at the bottom of the arc where it's at its fastest. And then what it does in this case is it just plows through some cars. And that's actually realistically done, to be honest. If the object has a lot of mass, it can transfer some of its momentum to the smaller masses, giving them a very big kick the way they go flying off, but the big mass doesn't care as much. So we talk about it as momentum being conserved in the collision. And momentum is mass times velocity. So a big mass like that pendulum bob with a little velocity can transfer to a small mass, a big kick in velocity that will make them go flying. So fun to watch and not necessarily physically impossible.
Nice. Okay. Good deal. So Dom, runs Hobbs off the road, takes the device. We don't really know why. We saw Charlize Theron sort of chat with him a little bit, but they did a good job storytelling here of we don't actually know for quite a while more why Dom did this. I think that most of the audience knows he didn't go fully bad, isn't going to kill any of his family or anything like that. But obviously something bigger is at play here. And, we find out, a little bit later, because we still, instead of, cutting right to that, there's all these scenes of Hobbs is arrested, right? They told him they disavow him. So now he's in prison. They put him right next to Shaw. the whole prison break and fight. And that turns out that Mr. Nobody is behind that because he wants to recruit him. And he's like, well, get out of prison and come work for us kind of thing. So they get Hobbs and Shaw out of prison, basically, and start working with the Nobodies. What I really liked about the sequence, so bringing the team in together, right? We finally get that sort of scene. They go over the Interpol top 10 list, right? Because now everybody's on the run again. Nobody's working on the quote unquote right side of the law. Roman being number 11 on the Interpol list. I don't know why digs like this are funny to me, but they really are.
It's because the actor is delightful at reacting to them.
Right. But here I have to say that, like, I can't remember if it's Mr. Nobody or Little Nobody, but like the whole shadow agency, right, is very good at its exposition, right? So we get a little bit more about Cipher. It turns out she was in charge of Owen Shaw, the bad guy from movie 6, who in movie 6 we learned was in charge of Braga, who was in movie 4. So just all these sort of levels and levels of retcon. It's like, sure. And considering how convoluted and retconny it is, they do a very good job of just like flashing pictures up as like a slideshow for the team. But Cipher and Dom come in, concussion grenades and stuff like that. They take the God's Eye. I wrote down again here, Dom is wearing sleeves. So you can tell he's a different type of Dom, The whole thing is just sort of weird. And as you said, it's a different type of movie, really. Like, I can't imagine them doing this in like 5, which was like, Ocean's 11. But it works.
It does work. And we still get the cars, right? We have the wrecking ball sequence, and then of course the 0-day exploit and the sort of zombie cars that's coming up. So we still do get the car sequences.
Yes. And we definitely get into that a lot more with Bea, our expert. So stick around for that interview. But yeah, that's right. There's so many more sequences still coming up. So yeah, so this is where we get more of that background, that Shaw's, military record. Potentially he's this misunderstood good guy like all the rest of them, even though at this point he has still killed Han. So I have not forgiven him. In that sort of time period too, we finally find out why Dom is working for Cipher. That Elena and her and Dom's baby, which we didn't know, are hostages in this plane that Cipher lives on to avoid, the law while hacking her way around the globe.
Yeah, and it does actually lead to one of the most fun sequences, which is Shaw with a baby.
Oh my God. Yeah, still maybe my favorite, like 5 minutes of all the Fast and Furious franchise. I know I've said similar things before in terms of, car chases and heists and stuff like that. But in terms of just sheer enjoyment of a 5-minute time period, yeah. Deckard Shaw, with the little headphones on the baby, just murdering people. Delightful.
Right. I know the things we enjoy in these franchises, but there's actually just some great comedic timing in that sequence and some great cuts. And for me, I always enjoy watching an actor have fun, and you can tell that the actor was enjoying that sequence.
Yes. Jason Statham understood the assignment, right? Cannot imagine Vin Diesel, as good as his acting is in this movie, doing that scene. Right? Like, if somehow they'd written it as Dom does that, it wouldn't have worked. Maybe they even tried it and it was like, but like Jason Statham making cute little faces at the baby and oh my God, just delightful.
And it's the way that we fully bring his character into the family. Right. So even though you still have some resentment about Han, it is clear that the audience is supposed to forgive him at this point because he's cute with a baby.
Yes. And some murdering of people needed to happen. And we are not going to watch our quote unquote, main character heroes, family members do that sort of thing. But we'll watch Deckard Shaw do it at this point. And probably all points. Like, he manages to stay sort of like above that whole has to, not kill people or whatever. Right. And yeah, 5 minutes ago, I said I don't forgive him for killing Han. And here I am being like, but he's so cute with the baby.
But we do lose a member of the family in this sequence, Elena.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's one probably not coming back from. There's still at least one more movie. And if Elena shows up, I won't be that shocked. But, they have her sister show up in 10. So probably not. But yeah, super ginger, Cypher's main bodyguard kind of guy. A guy from Game of Thrones who I loved. Yeah, shoots her in the head. So Elena's dead right in front of her son, right in front of Dom. Yeah, it's pretty intense, pretty dark.
Pretty grim overall. Now, in terms of the storytelling, it makes us feel better about Dom and Letty. Definitely Dom's relationship status at that point gets a little weird if Elena stays on. Although Elena and Buddy were cool with each other by the time they.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like we could have raised this child altogether. We did not need to kill
so. We did
Elena.
not need to kill her.
I believe that they would have had a perfectly acceptable, cross-continental relationship had they not just straight up murdered Elena. So yeah, that was rough. But of course, this EMP is needed because they want to access a Russian base and steal a nuclear submarine, and this EMP is the way to do that.
Of course, because who doesn't want to steal a nuclear submarine? That is what I asked.
Right. Yeah, if you're basically a Bond villain, what you need next is a nuclear submarine. Ideally not just bought on the black market. No, you need to steal it through some convoluted.
Had to go to Russia. You couldn't go to San Diego Bay.
That's an interesting point. I never even put that together because somehow stealing a Russian one, you just get this idea that it's like a little bit more loosey-goosey, like either the security is not as bad or that maybe the nuclear submarine itself is more badass because it's Russia,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not really gotten into. And we didn't even talk about, which we will with our expert, but in order to get this nuclear submarine, they need the codes, right? Which are attached to the arm of a guy in New York City. And so they hack every car in New York City. And that's a fun sequence too. So yeah, all of that happens so that they can go steal this nuclear submarine and have some of the most beautiful driving sequences probably of the franchise on that ice. The shot below the ice, shot above the ice, all these ridiculous cars out there, right? Like Roman always choosing like the wrong car for the.
So once again, our hero stunt people, stunt coordinators, and so on, this was mostly practically done. Cars out on ice. They actually did have Lamborghinis out there for Roman's car. Not one, obviously, because you can't get away with just having one car to film these sequences. But they actually did this practically again. So in terms of the physics for me, watching it, I was just like, well, you can't go that fast. You just can't go that fast. Even those of us who live in Southern California know that there are such things as snow tires that some people somewhere else might have to use. And they have different treads that allow you to gain better friction between the tire and the snow or the ice, so you can go forward without slipping. But they're usually like speed rated. You still can't go above typically 40 miles per hour and still have control of the car. And so that is clearly not what is happening in this sequence with the apparent velocity of the cars that we're watching. So can you drive on snow and ice and keep control of the car? Absolutely. At the speeds we're supposed to think that they're going at in this sequence? No. Once again, physics kind of. They just take it to an extreme.
Right. And yeah, that's definitely something we talked about with our stunt drivers. Like they're pretty much never going more than like 35 miles an hour and just do a really good job of speeding it up without it looking like it's sped up.
Sometimes it's forced perspective too. So like they're not necessarily speeding up the shots. We're just getting it from a perspective that makes it look faster. So there's amazing creative direction going on in some of these shots too.
When you're racing a nuclear submarine, it's not like a lot of people have like memories of seeing that in real life to be like, well, that's not how it would really work. You're just kind of like, wow, amazing. So,
well, and submarines aren't actually even meant to go really fast either. I think we have these ideas that submarines can go hundreds of miles per hour. And really, I think their maximum speed is probably close to the maximum speed of a car, if not less, because they got to plow through the water. And so it would not be as exciting, but they could have filmed this as a much slower speed chase to have it more realistic.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's definitely true because like the research vessels that I go on, they max out at like 11 knots, which is close to miles per hour. The container ships that I've been on, it's like 30 at the most.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know if you've ever seen the submarines coming in and out of San Diego Bay, but yeah, they're moving, but they're not going that fast.
Definitely a slower speed chase than it looked.
Right. And of course, Hobbs through moving missiles with his hands and all these other convoluted ways, they managed to blow up all the bad guy cars and get the sub actually to blow itself up, right? It shoots a heat-seeking missile that Dom manages to get to actually hit the submarine instead of him, which is we've been seeing that move in dogfight movies for 100 years probably. But then this one ends, the crescendo of this movie is, Dom blowing up the submarine and then obviously being too close to said explosion. I like his literal, and maybe this would be mine too if I was about to be blown up in an explosion, is he like lifts up his hands to like block himself from the explosion. Like that's gonna do anything. But thankfully all the team drive around him in their, apparently heat proof cars, and that's how he manages to survive this explosion.
Yep, heat proof, shock resistant, apparently no flammable liquids in them whatsoever. These cars are amazing.
That's true. That's true. Not true in any of the other times that they have explosions in those cars. But yeah, and also like, okay, so fire goes into all spaces, right? Even if you're hunched down or whatever, and there's 4 or 5 cars around you and a fire is coming over them, it doesn't just go over the top of one car to the top of the other car, right? It's going to suck down into the space where you are, right?
It can be. I mean, there are obviously ways that you can do some breaks and that it can get funneled. Fire can be affected by wind. My dad was a firefighter, and he actually had photos of like the fire tornadoes and stuff like that that you can get in high wind situations. And so I always think of the fact that fire can be affected, but it is a case where you're looking at it and they obviously are doing this instinctively on the spot, and fire tends to go against our instincts, which is what you were saying, right? Fire likes to get into places. So would this actually work? Probably not. Did it look awesome? Absolutely.
Right. Fair enough.
Well, and in the sequence in Cuba at the very beginning of this movie, Dom puts the car in reverse so that the flame isn't going towards him. And it's like, but you're still driving and oxygenating the combustion. And so that fire is going to keep going. So the imminent explosion is still coming. Just driving backwards doesn't necessarily help.
No, and that's an interesting thing. I really wonder if they had that sequence, because it doesn't really have anything to do with this movie. The cousin they introduce, being in Cuba, like none of that comes around again. But Dom's intrinsic understanding about how fire works is maybe what they were trying to introduce to us, in which case, fine. Good job.
Maybe that's it.
Yeah, so, all ends well, except for Elena. Dom brings the little baby who has not been named yet because Elena was going to wait to tell Dom and they were going to name it together, whatever. My biggest question from the end of this is, where are we? Like, whose rooftop apartment is this that we're in? Like, why aren't we in LA? Why aren't we at the big table in the backyard,
I think we're supposed to be in Manhattan somewhere. Okay. Was that the shot? Yeah. I don't know that anybody in the movie actually lived there, but I'd take that deck.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I just was like, where are we? But Shaw is there, right? Because now we forgive him because he rescued the baby. And then, Dom makes this big deal out of naming his son Brian, which, obviously for those of us audience members who can meta this knowledge that Paul Walker's is dead and his character Brian, won't be showing up again or whatever, is very nice. But in universe, it does seem a little weird. I don't know. I don't know that they call this kid Brian literally ever again in the movies. And just like, definitely in 10, it was just little B the whole time.
Yeah. It was a nice reminder that another member of the family was supposed to still be with us at that table.
Right. Fair enough. Well, let's talk about the Rotten Tomatoes. In this particular one, a little bit lower from last time, which again kind of follows what Lisa and I feel about it. The critics' tomato meter is 67% and the audience meter is 72. So pretty close, but definitely a bit of a dip. And the one sentence consensus is The Fate of the Furious opens a new chapter in the franchise, fueled by the same infectious cast chemistry and over-the-top action fans have come to expect. Yeah, so really nothing bad to say about it in that review. I think maybe it is sort of really seen as a transition, right? Like 7 absolutely could have ended the franchise. And the fact that they took a couple years and decided to push on. Mentioning the cast chemistry is definitely a big part of, I think, why this movie is really good, even at all.
Yep. And why the franchise keeps going.
Right. Exactly. Well, let's get into our interview then with the computer scientist.
She wiped it all. Took God's eye. That was the one thing we could use to find him.
You got, Princess?
Funding, Terrell. But I've got a couple of minutes to spare. If you want me to send you to the hospital. Again.
Your rules.
First off, that's not my name.
Little nobody.
Don't call me that.
Oh, that's definitely sticky.
Great, do me a favor and tell your majesty over there that we're going to find Toretto. We find Toretto together as a team.
Wait a minute, guys. I think Deck is actually onto something. How do you think Dom and Cipher got into the country without us knowing? Ghost flights.
I thought untraceable aircraft was all internet conspiracy stuff.
It's not. Satellites and radar grids all across the globe shift like an ocean. And they've got channels that open and close, and theoretically, if you know the right people who know the right patterns,
You can fly right through the blind spots completely undetected.
So you know where Dom is headed?
Yeah, New York.
Our guest expert today is Bea Gandica, who is a founder of the Nuevo Foundation and program manager at Microsoft. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I love your voice.
Yeah, she really has that good NPR, sit down with me voice.
Thank you. I'm so flattered.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, Bea. We're really excited to get into this. I definitely know nothing about coding and hacking and computer systems and all that kind of stuff, but I feel like even I know that it's not super realistic the way they do it in Fast and Furious, but I'm excited to get into it. So maybe can we start off, can you quickly define what is coding, and then tell us a little bit about how you got into the field and what you do at the Nueva Foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. So coding is like you and me, I right now speak in English, right? And so coding is how we can speak to computers. So how can we tell a computer to do something? That can be, for example, send an email, right? Right now, you just go to like Gmail, Outlook, whatever you use, and you click send, and then somehow it gets sent, right? So in order for that send button to do something, somebody had to write what to do. Somebody had to say every time a user clicks on send, you're going to go and check the address where it's intended, the address where it's coming. So it's going to get to some other inbox. So all that stuff is what coding is. So we use it in every day. It's just that sometimes we're only users, not the creators of what happens behind the scenes. But it has gotten to a point that I think anybody can learn how to code. There's a lot of available resources and they're free, which is unlikely when it comes to other professions versus this. As long as you have internet and a computer, you're pretty set to go. And how I got into this, it was I really love playing video games, like Nintendo and PlayStation. That's what I grew up with. And so I was always curious that how come if I touch the button, it would do something on the video game, right? Like to me, it's like, it's crazy because if I touch another button, it does something else. But how is the connection from the video game to the actual part? But I'm from Venezuela. I didn't learn how to code until I came to college in Wisconsin. It was super remote. All you could do is go, it's not even Google, it was like MSN Encarta, which is like Microsoft old thing, like which now would be like Wikipedia. And so I would go to Encarta and learn as much as I can. But it wasn't like somebody came into my school and said, hey, there's this thing called computer science that you'll be able to have a job or you'll be able to do big things. So even if you do something in Venezuela, people in, I don't know, Kenya can have access to what you're building. That wasn't the case. So that's the reason why I started Rebel Foundation along with 5 friends. Because how do we make sure that we have the next generation of students having access to what computer science is? And how do we make sure that that is possible, that is attainable? It's not like you have to be certain color or go to certain schools or have certain amount of like income in your house in order for you to do it. So that's what the nonprofit does, is how do we democratize computer science to everyone in the US and in the world? Because I believe that in less than 10 years, hopefully sooner, learning how to code in schools will become just like you learn math or you learn physics or you learn biology or chemistry or any of those in order to be able to have some jobs, especially with all the advances that we now have in AI and like ChatGPT and whatnot. Like it's important that we all learn.
I think that's really awesome. And I hope people after listening to this podcast will go look up the Nuevo Foundation because it sounds like you are doing amazing work. Now, this is what you do. This is what you work on. And yet you watch movies and more movies seem to show people coding or hacking. And we'll get to that more specifically in a bit. But are you able to enjoy movies knowing what you know?
Yes, I really do. I like all the shows. It's pretty hard for me to say this is a bad show, this is a bad movie. Somehow, like once I get in like the first 10 minutes, I'm like, okay, let's see what this movie is all about. And of course, I enjoy it, right? Like the Fast and the Furious movies, I enjoy it. There's like the Transformers movies, like Iron Man movies. Like all those movies are super cool, even when sometimes you're like, okay, well, we're not there. Or like, this is a little bit of a stretch. But I still enjoy it. I love movies.
That's great. So yeah, since I, had never took any computer science classes or anything like that, to me, I think hacking looks like typing really fast on your computer, sometimes counter hacking where someone is hacking into it at the same time and you're trying to keep them out. What is hacking even, and what would it actually look like?
Yeah, so like in movies, like most of the time it's just like super fast, right? Like it's like a montage of like a ticking clock, making sure that things happen, like a Jack Bauer 24 type of thing. Like, if this doesn't happen, then something's gonna blow up. But in the real world, it's more be a little bit of like a zero-day exploit. And the reason it's called zero-day is because it refers to the fact that developers have no time or 0 days to fix or patch some vulnerability that has been exploited. So hacking, what that is you code something like a program, right? Like the Go type program. And then hacking is how do you break into that program to do what you desire instead of what the program was meant to do. In order to do that, you have to make sure that you can find the vulnerabilities. That's the main job of a hacker, is how do you find the vulnerabilities that exist or might exist in a given program. But in terms of like how fast you have to type, I don't think it's really that is a little bit of a drama or like storytelling, or maybe like to make the movie a little bit more exciting, because in reality, hacking is a very complex process. It requires like super meticulous planning because you're playing on finding the flaws of the programmer that programmed that particular piece of software. So you have to have a deep understanding of the system that you're going against. You need to understand what vulnerabilities exist in order to make sure that you can break them. And it involves a lot of digging, making sure that, okay, is it in this data? Is it in this path? Is it in that place? Is it in the other one? You have to also analyze the traffic, like where is the data going, and find those weak points. So it's not necessarily about super fast hacking or like typing or anything like that. It's not a race against time necessarily. It's more about researching, strategizing, and crafting attacks to break into something that you want to.
All right. I kind of figured it probably wasn't dependent on people's typing skills, but it's good to know. So you just mentioned the 0-day exploit, which was specifically used in The Fate of the Furious to create self-driving cars out of empty cars that were sitting on the street. Is that actually something that's possible?
So can it be possible that you have all the cars going right away? I think that's a little bit of a stretch. So we do have autonomous vehicles, right? That they can drive and could be more exploitable than cars that were made maybe in the 90s. So because they have more complex systems, like the other autonomous car, they would have like sensors, algorithms, cameras, things to safely operate, and those could be exploited. However, like the manufacturers of cars and the software developers have invested a significant amount of resources into making sure that security measures are embedded into the software itself. But they have been hacked in the past. But it's important just to understand that it's not as easy. And even if you were to break into like one particular model, doesn't mean, like in the movie, that it was every single car, like Benz and little cars and big cars and trucks and all that stuff. If that were to happen, it would be not all at once. It just doesn't seem that plausible that would happen. And it would have to be more modern cars. And I don't know that we'll ever be in a position where all the cars in the world will be modern, because we know that people like to drive older cars as well. Those don't have necessarily those systems where you're sending signals to like the maker or seeing the traffic or those kind of things. But can it be possible to break into a car of a given model of a given manufacturer? Yes. Can you do it all at once, like in the movie? Not really. At least not right now.
Yeah, and they do make a point out of making Cipher, who's Charlize Theron's character, and Ramsey, both these like ultimate hacker, sort of people. Like they're up on a pedestal, no one has any pictures of them, sort of thing. So maybe those are the types of people that actually could make zombie cars out of all of New York City. I love that sequence so much, honestly. I'll forgive them for that one. Well, I'm curious about your opinions on like the portrayal of the different characters themselves, right? So like Cipher, Ramsey, and then Tej also, who early on in the series owns a mechanic shop and just kind of says like, oh, I had a life before you, and then he's kind of the tech guy. And then as soon as they need him to be, a really good hacker and stuff like that, he's like right there with Ramsey. And to your sort of introduction, anyone can and should learn these sorts of skills. But what does it take to be an elite coder or hacker? Is that even a thing in real life?
So this story is, to me, is fascinating, right? Because how he goes from being a mechanic to go into computers. People can change careers, right? We see this a lot, especially in computer science, where you have folks that have gone through maybe business or maybe accounting or maybe finance or law, and then they do some sort of boot camp where they learn how to code in 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the program, and then they become a computer scientist. So can that be possible? Absolutely. Can you go from one day to another being a mechanic to being a hacker? There's always outliers, right? Like there always be these savant folks that can make that happen. However, I think that the transition from one field to another, it requires a lot of motivation, dedication, making sure that you're going to study, that you're going to learn the new process, that you can make that change of career. So it's possible, but becoming an expert in hacking typically requires years of study. Like I haven't hacked into it. Hopefully, if I ever do, it will be ethical hacking, which is the other side, when you actually hacking just to find vulnerabilities so they can be patched, not to exploit into something. But I think it's in the world of the movies, is a lot of time they condense the timelines just to make the movie work. But in reality, it looks a little bit accelerated.
That's fascinating. And I personally, yeah, I love how they build up Tej because, yeah, he was a mechanic. Then he was their electronics guy. And then he was, but yeah, the condensed storyline there is a little bit much, but he's awesome. I love him. So you just mentioned ethical hacking. And when Ramsey is introduced in Furious 7, she's introduced as a hacktivist. Were they using that term to basically imply she did ethical hacking? And also, how do you feel about her depiction as a computer scientist?
So to be honest, I don't know necessarily what activist is. But what typically you have an ethical hacker, which is people that work for companies, organizations. Their goal is to find the vulnerabilities that exist so it can get patched, right? But in terms of Ramsey portrayals, to me is amazing because first of all, she's a female character, right? To see someone in cybersecurity that's a female, that's highly skilled and is instrumental in making sure that the God's Eye is a powerful hacking tool, that's amazing. But like hackers and or hacktivists or computer scientists in general come from a lot of diverse backgrounds, and the skills can be found in all genders, right? It doesn't have to be one color, one gender, or anything like that in order for you to be a computer scientist. And I'm super happy that they chose a lady. It might be slightly exaggerating, right? That she has all these powers for the storytelling purposes of the movie. Because to do something like God's Eye program, it will require extensive knowledge and expertise to get this done. And typically, the folks that can afford something like that have to be like government entities, just because it requires a lot of power. Like when I say power, it's like computer power to make that happen. But it's great to have someone that's a female, that's intelligent woman represented in the world of technology. It's important to have those role models.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Talked a little bit about God's Eye, and it describes briefly, albeit, the one line description of it is that it's a computer program capable of hacking into basically anything on a digital network in order to find any person. So, ATM cameras, phones, all that kind of stuff are shown. Is something like that realistic? This seems to come up in other pop culture. Like I know it was in the Batman movie and stuff like that. Is this just sort of general surveillance paranoia about the world? Is that kind of all it is? Or is there actually something that someone could code and put together that's similar?
So in theory, the idea of this computer program capable of tracking someone using any digital device in the network is fascinating. However, in practice, it's very challenging. However, it's possible. So tracking individuals across multiple devices and network require a lot of interconnected systems. So that's what I was mentioning in the past. Like you would have to make sure that everything is connected to each other. So an example could be like to hack into an individual camera. Like in the movies, it shows that it was hacked into a phone and an ATM. We have two major phones in the world right now, right? The iPhone and the Droid. So you would have to be able to have access to both of them. And that requires massive amount of processing, like to even get there. How would you do that? And not only that, but if you have an iPhone or a Droid, you get patches, right? Like your phone gets updated more often than not, at least once a month. You get updates like, hey, you need to update this for security vulnerabilities, right? And then you update it. So even if you were to crack into one of those two operating systems or like the ATM or like the phones, those get patched. So now the folks that don't patch things, those you potentially could access, But as a programmer hacker, you have to keep innovating because you're going to go and find the vulnerabilities to exploit. And then you have good hackers or ethical hackers that are finding the same vulnerabilities, but to get fixed, not to get anything in return. So it's some sort of a race. But from an ethics perspective, there are privacy concerns too, right? Like if you think about GDPR. So GDPR in Europe, it stands for General Data Protection Regulations and legal restrictions of how you can use it. So if you just go and put a camera in Europe, the ramifications that have versus in the US are different. Hopefully at some point in this country, we'll also have some sort of protection when it comes to that. But hackers tend to bend the rules, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be called hackers. But I don't know that we would have a God's eye necessarily in place because it requires sophisticated surveillance technology, making sure that all the collection methods are there. But maybe a government might have it. But to the extent of to track individuals to the way that it is, there's legal and society expectation of privacy, which will make that a little bit hard, at least from a human perspective.
You brought up GDPR in Europe and how in the movies, particularly the movies that we're talking about, predate the implementation of that in Europe, if I recall correctly. But yeah, one of the things that God's Eye does is it exploits stuff all over the world. That seems to imply that the worldwide networks talk to each other in a fluid way. Does our current infrastructure allow for this sort of hacking of worldwide computer systems simultaneously?
The question of hacking worldwide computer systems simultaneously, it's difficult. And I'll tell you why. So the Internet computers does span over the globe, right? Like we have diverse architectures, technologies, and security measures. And diverse because every country can have their own regulations, every continent, etc. And when you're hacking multiple systems all at once, it would require people in the entire world to agree on something. So let's just start on that. And then on top of that, you have to have the knowledge of all the various systems that exist. They could be similar, but they might not. And then on top of that, you have to access altogether the vulnerabilities on all the targets that you're trying. So, for example, if something in the US can be completely different than Canada, than Mexico, and to do it all over the place, it would require a lot of coordination. There have been some coordinated attacks that have occurred in the past, but they typically focus on something specific, on a target, on a group of systems rather than entire worldwide. So, for example, when I say a specific system could be on the Alexa devices, right? It wouldn't be on the Alexa devices, on the Google Home, on the cities, on this, on computers, on TVs, on Xbox. And typically, they're targeted because you need to make sure that you're going for one thing, and that's the vulnerability that you are exploiting. So it's important to acknowledge that these threats are real and they're constantly evolving because unfortunately there's people that's their work, that's the bread and butter, and just go and exploiting somebody else's software. But I'm leaning towards highly unlikely because of the amount of effort that it involves might not be worth the payoff.
Well, and so we mostly are talking about movies 7 and 8 because, it's the introduction of Ramsey and God's Eye and then Cipher as well. But Cipher has remained, a bad guy, and Ramsey and Tej have remained, on the team and necessary through the other movies as well. So I wanted to just sort of go over briefly a couple of those other times. So yeah, there's Project Ares in movie 9, which is like a hacking into weapon systems. That one operates, even more broadly, right? The one-liner for that is it can affect anything that operates on code, which seems like way too wide a net to cast. But it also requires a pirate satellite that infects other satellites, and then that satellite has to be hacked in orbit, in place. Is there anything like that you can think of that's in existence or at all possible?
So for the Project Ares, that's focused on weapon systems, right? So critical system, including transportation, energy grids, and communication networks, rely on software and computerized control systems. That's a fact. But while it's true that vulnerabilities on code can have significant consequences, the idea of one single project being capable to affect a wide range of systems is a bit exaggerated. So in reality, security researchers and organizations, they constantly work on patching, right? Like we've been talking about this, that's the work, that's the bread and butter is patching system. And the complexity and diversity of this system to evolve for a single project to have all broad-reaching effects without being quickly detected and mitigated, it's just very hard to comprehend. But there are some computer systems like SCADA. SCADA is supervisory control and data acquisition that is big target for hacks. Why SCADA? So these SCADA systems are used to monitor and control processes at the industrial and infrastructure levels, such as power grids, water treatment plants, oil refineries, and manufacturing facilities. So the issue is that these systems are often not patched because they're often running on all computer programs that just work. And sometimes they are off the network, meaning there's no connection there. So as a result, vulnerabilities for the SCADA systems are not patched as often as your phone or my phone will be patched. So it's important to make sure that we're vigilant and prioritize cybersecurity to ensure that all our infrastructure is up to date since we're interconnected. That is on the project areas. And when it comes to the satellite question, right, a pirate satellite was used to infect other satellites. In the movie, it shows that you have to send a satellite in order to hack others. So satellites, especially the ones that are already in the orbit, so not something that you're sending, but the ones that are already there, they communicate each other with ground stations. So it's not necessarily that you have to be in space in order to connect with the satellite. We can do that today with some protocols to connect with them, and they are encrypted. So to hack into a satellite, you will need to exploit the vulnerabilities in order to connect to the satellite software or communication channel, but not necessarily like sending something or launching a pirate satellite into orbit to infect other satellites. That would be challenging, that would be expensive, and that would be risky because it will require access to space technology, deep understanding of the satellite system, and how you navigate the legal and regulatory frameworks that exist, right? Because at the end of the day, again, this is space activities have their own set of rules. It's unheard of that you need another satellite to hack into other satellites in the real world, but maybe that would be a new way of how you go and attack other ones. But the restrictions exist in terms of the technical, the legal aspect, and the logistical challenges of how you even launch the satellite.
Yeah, that was one of the things that got for me. Like if you launch a satellite, people tend to notice. It's usually kind of obvious that a space launch has occurred. So it's like, wow, how'd they get a satellite up there that nobody was tracking or noticed?
Yeah. Well, what you're saying is interesting. I never really thought about the idea that maybe bad guys will get ideas from Fast and Furious movies. Like, oh, we never thought about setting up our own satellite to hack satellites. Hopefully that's not the case.
Disclaimer, do not get any ideas from our show to
Right.
commit nefarious deeds.
Right, exactly. We had to say it with the stunt driver, do not try this at home. I didn't think we'd have to say it necessarily with the do not launch your own pirate satellite. So, that's awesome. But honestly, everything you've said about like, well, no, that's not really how this all works. It's not all interconnected. It at least fits with kind of the stakes that we're talking about from those later movies, right? By movie 7, it is like, Mr. Nobody, you're the only team in the world I trust. And of course, cars are somehow part of this, So like all of that is like, okay, yeah, sure. Maybe in our realistic world, you can't hack, an Xbox and an iPhone and a whatever all at the same time. But that's exactly why they need Dom and the teams. So I'm not going to watch these movies any differently, I feel like, after our conversation.
Once again, confirmation they have superpowers.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So we've talked about the way coding and hacking are shown in the Fast and Furious movies. Are there movies or shows that show them more realistically? Like when you watch it, you're like, oh yeah, that's how that would be done.
So one of the movie, I mean, it might be controversial, but is the movie Snowden. Because it's based on the real life of Edward Snowden, the whistle blowing, English. Yeah. Because like at the end of the day, even though the film was made a little bit more about the political implications, it also provided real insight into very real methods that are used by intelligence agencies and the potential that it have when it comes to surveillance capabilities, right? Like making sure that they can see of what you're doing. And shows like the ethical dilemma that the hacker is going through as well, right? Because I believe that cybersecurity folks also have this dilemma, like, do we say it? How much do you share also to the public when things do get hacked? And so I think that that's depicted in an accurate manner. Obviously, portrayals might be grounded in action-packed scenes like movie like Fast and Furious. And even they have some embellishment of the storytelling at the end of the day. The good thing is that you enjoy these movies as a show of entertainment and inspiration, while also recognizing a little bit of the need of the skepticism and critical thinking when it comes to what's really feasible and accurate in certain scenarios.
Right. Yeah. And not being super paranoid that your car is going to just take off without you at any moment.
I would love to have at some point a car that can parallel parking because I don't do that. And so, it's not everything that bad.
Well, we talked about at the beginning of the episode, about how to get into coding and stuff like that. But, how do you recommend doing that?
For anybody that wants to learn how to code, everything that we offer is for free. It's www.nuevofoundation.org. What we do have in there, if you want to get into coding, so we do have 3 workshops that are focused on cybersecurity. And then for folks that might have never touched a computer or coding, that might be you, Melissa. No homework, just in case you want to. We have all our workshops are in there. They're in English, they're in Spanish, they're in Mandarin, they're in Portuguese. We have multiple languages. And the whole idea is that it's in a story. It's not like, hey, this is an algorithm, we're going to do some math and all stuff. It's more like, this is a story, we're going to move to the Turtle Island, and we're going to learn a language called Python because we're going to make the shapes. They're all completely free. And if you're an adult and you're listening to this, you can still learn. It's just that you can avoid the storytelling, but at the end of the day, you can learn certain skills because once you get the basics is when you start thinking, oh, maybe I can do this. Or maybe you don't like certain Instagram filters or TikTok filters or all that, but you can create your own. And that's how, at least how we get the kids to think that one thing is coding to make something like a piece of software to make money like a corporation, but also you can make things to make the world a better place. Right? There might be a need in your community that could be resolved or could be alleviated if there was a piece of software that can help you find potentially like shelters in the city, right? Or where do people that cannot afford food because they're going through difficult situations, they could go to a site and find the nearby restaurant that is potentially, not throwing the food away, but giving it to people in need. That's the community aspect, right? Like that's what we try to drive with the nonprofit. And we've been able to teach 15,000 students in 33 countries. So we're very proud. And the whole idea is for anybody. And we believe that anyone can code.
For those who want to get into coding or explore it more, we'll make sure that we put a link to the Nuevo Foundation in the show notes. I don't know if you've ever watched the show Mythic Quest, but that's something I've been watching recently. There's a lot of programming stuff in that, and they say basically the same thing, where it's like adults can get into this, and usually creating your own relatively simple video game is like basically how they have people start. Yeah, it's a very silly show, but like I'm curious now about the depiction of programming in that because it is a much more like solitary, sit at your desk for days and weeks and overnights and eating candy and stuff like that. I'm like, this feels realistic.
But there are people that are like that. I can tell you that I work with folks like at my main job at Microsoft. They're like that. And that's okay too. But that doesn't mean you have to fit that model in order to be an engineer. And that's what's important. And that's why representation, it's very important that it doesn't matter however you look, all colors of the rainbow, you can do it too. Like it's not like I don't drink Mountain Dew. Like in the movies, it's typically a Mountain Dew and then a hoodie and big head. Yeah, no. I mean, you can, right? But you don't have to.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I really appreciate having you here and learning all of that kind of stuff. And I really like it when, everything you tell me that you know better than I do, it's a take away from my enjoyment of the movie. And that makes me really happy.
My day just got a whole hell of a lot better. Mr. Nobody, you want to tell me why you just put me in a room with this tea and crumpets eating criminals?
With a big mouth on a small head. Coming from prisoner 6753.
Don't think we've forgotten everything that you've done.
We are not teaming up with this guy.
Let's get one thing clear. I ain't on your team. I don't care about you, your crew, or your little family. I'm here for Cipher.
Are you going to apply for a job?
I think that tight t-shirt's cutting off the circulation of your brain. You should get bigger size. Cipher came to me first. Wanted me to steal Nightshade for her. When I said no, she went after my brother.
Ah, yes. Brother Owen, who could forget him, huh? Former Hellraiser and current guest at a nasty little black site prison.
Cipher corrupted him, left him for dead. So if I get a shot to take it down, believe me, Flicks, I'm taking it.
You're taking my boot right up your ticket.
Guys, the fastest way to find Cipher is through Toretto. Now, aside from myself, there's only 2 men in the world that have ever managed to actually track him down with any success. And guess what? They're both standing in front of me right now. So like it or not, you two are going to work together. You got that?
That wraps up this episode of The Facts and the Furious. We want to thank our guest, Bea Gandica, and we want to thank all of you for listening. Check out the show notes for links to our guest and other things we talked about. Remember, reality-based physics comes and goes, but family is forever.
We'll see you next time on The Facts and the Furious when we discuss the movie Hobbs and Shaw, woo, spin-offs, and welcome experts in immunology and biomedical devices to the family.
Vroom.